So I was born in 1949 in Hong Kong, and when I was almost 2 years old, my parents emigrated us to the U.S. and I remember we took a ship then, and I had my second birthday on the ship. So my grandfather, my father's father, was in Los Angeles already. He had a house in the Rampart district near Tommy's Hamburger. And so we lived in one of the rooms in his home, and my uncle and his 5 children lived in the other room, and then my grandfather was there as well, and until we could all kind of get on our feet. And that was a very typical way in which, you know, immigrants transition. My father was actually a U.S. citizen. My grandfather was an international student, and so at Berkeley, and so my father and his brother were born in Berkeley. But he grew up in China, and so when he tried to claim his U.S. citizenship by birthright, they denied him, and he had to get an attorney to fight for his citizenship. But he was able to get it, and that's how we were able to come to the U.S. So I was 2 at the time. We lived with my grandfather for 7 years, and so I had a chance to, you know, experience as the youngest of 3 daughters in an immigrant family home, you know, LA and a neighborhood. But I will say that my parents, and I think my mother in particular, was not entirely comfortable, you know, in what was still a strange environment for her. And so I grew up, and because we were 3 girls, in a very protective environment. We didn't sleep over at other people's houses. They didn't come over to play. And so it was fairly sheltered. And eventually, my father did get a job that took him to the Bay Area, and we all moved, and that was the first time we left our grandfather's house. And we went, he worked in San Francisco, so we lived in Berkeley and in Richmond and for a while. And eventually my father, who was well educated, he also was an international student at one time, and he got his master's in economics from Stanford. So he was interested in banking, and so he began the first Chinese-American bank in Los Angeles, which is Cathay Bank. So, but it took quite a lot. He was denied a lot of opportunity when he worked for American banks. And so seeing my parents struggle made a very big impression on me. But they were raised in a Chinese environment, and where they were the majority for the most part, even though Hong Kong was colonized, and they also had that experience. But in growing up, there were times when I felt we were slighted, and I didn't understand why. And my father would just sort of blow it off and said, "Oh, those people are just stupid." And he could say that, I think, because he grew up as a majority. And I couldn't feel it because I never grew up as a majority. And when those things happened, I always wondered, did we do something wrong? You know, something wrong with us? And so I had different wonderings in growing up than my parents did. And they were not able to put those into context in a way that I could understand or felt was real for me. So,
do you have any examples of?
You know, we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and so our vacations were mainly road trips into California, Yosemite, or other public places. And so I remember one summer that we were driving through Central California, and we stopped at a little coffee shop to eat, and we sat down, and they wouldn't come to our table. And eventually we realized they weren't going to serve us. And so, it was one of those times my father just said, "Oh, these people are stupid," and we left. But I do think about, how it might have felt for him in front of his family. And so there were many moments of disrespect that I saw they had to endure because of who they are, because they spoke with an accent. Both my parents did speak English, but not their preference, but they did speak English. So it left a powerful impression on me. And when I got to UCLA, I really, honestly, I was 17 and I didn't even know what I was going to college for. I just knew I had to go. And I had to go as a girl and as the youngest. I had to go to to university, someplace within driving distance. I couldn't go away to school. We didn't have that kind of money, but also they were very protective. And so, luckily, in LA we have a few choices, and I went to UCLA, commuted for the first year, and I really wanted to live outside my family home. I really wanted some independence. So I actually worked at the student store, and I saved my money. And in those days, you could save enough money to get an apartment. And after the first year, I told my dad I was going to move out, and I had my own money to do it. And he was quite unhappy about it, but I said I would continue to go to school if he paid the tuition. So that's what I did. And I moved into my own apartment with a high school friend, and I was just thrilled to be kind of out on my own, because I really felt that my parents' view of the world was so different than mine, and more restricted, at least I thought, than mine. And I wanted to explore for myself what was true for myself.
Can you tell me what year you came onto campus?
I came in the fall of 1967, right after high school. So at the time, the cutoff age was, my birthday's in November, so the cutoff age was later, so I was 17 when I graduated from high school and came to UCLA. So really had no clue. And I started as an English major because I did well in English in high school. And I took my first English class at UCLA, and I thought, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? I can't do this, So I changed to anthropology, which I thought was very fascinating, but I didn't know what I would do with it. And then I ended with a degree in psychology. So it took me a little while. Anthropology interested me, I think, in retrospect, because it talked about culture. And my parents, I was clearly, at least at that time, bicultural. I was not multicultural yet. And my parents, while I think to some degree they were anchored in Chinese culture. And I think they didn't see that. And I was a little bit more straddled. And so anthropology, in my view at the time, was about straddling cultures and observing them. And I thought that would give me some answers. I had many questions. And eventually, I thought of psychology as, really it is about the culture, but it is about individuals and how they deal with it. And I think many people whom I've talked to who at that time went into psychology, it's really about me. I want to figure that out, And so, not that it gave me all those answers, but it was sufficiently interesting for me to finish. Barely, I must say, because, the civil rights movement, the women's movement was going on at the time, and it was so much more interesting than the classroom. And so I cut many classes, but I was really comforted when I got to college by the fact my parents would never have to see a report card of mine if I didn't show them. So, so I barely graduated, I must say, but I had a great time. There was, the civil rights movement was well underway. There was the Vietnam War. There were many things going on at the time that in the student communities, it didn't seem right. And for me, coming out of my sheltered environment, I feel very grateful for that time, because it opened my mind to ideas and possibilities instead of just keeping my head down, that there was an encouragement to step out, to speak out, to think independently. And I think I was thinking somewhat independently, but clearly my family training was, you think what you like, but you don't say anything. You say what we, prescribe that is said, or you behave in the way we prescribe to behave. And so this opened the door for much more. And I think the civil rights movement in particular, although it was particularly framed with black and white, and a little bit with, black and brown and white, it didn't really include Asians, even though Asians were very intimately involved in some of the core work of the civil rights movement. We weren't really part of the narrative. And, but to hear the narrative for other people of color, I began to see and to shape my own view of the world that was very different from my parents. And it began to make sense to me.
Can you kind of draw kind of a contrast between maybe your parents' view of the world and your evolving view of the world at that time?
My parents' view of the world is that China is at the center of the world. Chinese culture is at the center of the world. And anyone who doesn't think so, is just ignorant. And so they were very grounded and confident about where they were grounded. And I was not grounded, because I was in two cultures. They were clear about who they were. They were Chinese. I was not Chinese in the way that they were. And I could never be. So what was I? And then to redefine then that I am hyphenated and that's okay, and that other people are like me. And there's a place. We didn't know what the place, I didn't know what the place was, but I knew there was a place for me. And I wasn't just outside. And I was outside of Chinese culture, and I was outside of American culture. So where was my place in the world?
And how did the civil rights movement then resonate with that?
I realized, even though the narrative was mainly black and white, that there were other people who were experiencing that otherness, that outside of everything, and trying to find a legitimate place. And as a as a non-African American, looking at African Americans, I could see they have a place, but I couldn't see my own place because there was not a narrative for Asian Americans at the time. But to know that I could see a place for people who felt outside of everything, that there might be a place for me. And that it did spark a lot of discussion among Asian Americans on campus who had some similar feeling about that there was a place and we had to define it. But, you know, among the friends I made, we all were challenged, you know, sort of our values, our kind of moral compass, our perspectives, our social justice perspective was being formed. And there was a lot of discussion about that among us, you know, in the midst of just being college students and, you know, growing up in the normal ways. That was very much, began to be somewhat the center of social life, you know, and eventually, so my memory is not as clear. I remember the Are You Curious Yellow conference. I did not remember it being at UCLA, but I remember we had a piece of, you know, a small piece of that, this group of friends of mine to present something. And frankly, I was so absorbed in thinking about that at the time that I didn't remember that much about the overall conference. But that was a culminating point of, you know, we were meeting and then we did something. So that was the something, one of the early somethings that we did. The other part of what...
Can you talk more about that?
You know, and I, in retrospect, 50 years later, you know, it was like we were very naive, and we created a skit, which I don't remember most of it, but we created a little skit that we were going to do to spark some conversation, and so it's practicing this skit. And I'm generally quite introverted, and my family background and my family kind of training made me even more so. And so this was coming out to do something out in the public, you know, acting something out that was very different for me, very nerve-wracking, you know. And so everything else is a blank except I had to do this one thing to be a part of this conversation. You know, that was something that I needed to do and I wanted to do, but it was a difficult thing. And I think that the years, those years in the context of civil rights and women's movement, you know, really challenged me, and I think many others, to do things that we were not trained to do, we're not used to doing, we were told we shouldn't do, and yet we knew we had to do. So, so constant challenge of stepping out, of being more of who you could be, of getting courage. You know, so those are some of the internal things I remember, perhaps sadly more than some of the external things. But I remember there were women's groups, Asian American women's groups, study groups that I went to. I was part of. Mie Iwataki was part of some of those, and talking about about women's roles, reflecting on it, having a place to talk about it, and especially with coming from a family of daughters, and as the youngest daughter. I had always grown up thinking that, you know, that I was, as the youngest of three daughters, that I was the last chance to have a boy, and I didn't turn out to be a boy, so I felt I had to be my father's son. So in many ways I played that out in the family to some degree. my father had a master's, so I better get a master's, and but my father was a banker, and over time he was able to, to fulfill his dream, and so I had to be in nonprofits. My bit of rebellion continues. So, but in terms of other things being more interesting than class at UCLA, in trying to define who we were as Asian Americans, I spent a lot of time in Chinatown. And there were groups of students who were in Chinatown from different universities, trying to do the same thing. And we formed a group under a few different titles, and we gathered at the Chinatown Teen Post for a while. We began a community newspaper called Chinese Awareness that we produced out of the Gidra office and used the Gidra equipment to do. They were good enough to, let us go in there, and we would, hand it out in the community. Those who could speak Chinese well enough would go into the sewing factories and try to organize, or what we thought was organizing. I'm not sure we really knew what we were doing at all, but people who were there became involved in different things like Yellow Brotherhood. Judy Chu was there in Yellow Brotherhood. Mike Ng, before they, were a couple, was there with Stuart Quo and many others who were at the reunion. May and Rocky, and all of us were just individuals at the time, trying to figure it out for the Chinese portion of it. The Chinatown was important to me because it reflected my parents' experience, and I needed to be connected to that. And it was still part of my experience. But those of us who were students, we had our other foot that could navigate outside of Chinatown because we had language, we had education, we had cultural understanding of the American side. So when you are a bridge in that way, then there's some obligation. There's a place for a bridge. Even when I was executive director at Chinatown Service Center, I was not Chinese enough for some. I didn't speak enough, I didn't read, I didn't, and so forth. But that never bothered me because I understood what my role needed to be. So I could reach farther into City Hall than they could, even though I couldn't reach as far as they thought. That all of us were still blocked. But if I could, then that was what I needed to do. So to continue to push in, make roads for everybody. And I think those values came from those times at UCLA. And, while I didn't have a direct hand in forming, I think, Asian American Studies. Asian American Studies became really important because it legitimized our experience, as I'm sure many have said. But in having Campbell Hall to hang out in and, having a place where we belonged was really important to then solidify those values and then carry them out into the world. Ultimately, UCLA was a short period in my life, a 4-year period, an impactful period, but still relatively short. And to carry that then out into the world and what I did, I think is the enduring impact of it.
That's beautifully said. I'd like to know a little more about Chinese awareness because no one else has really talked about Chinese awareness. So can you tell
I wish I wish I had kept some copies. It was not as cool or slick as Ghidra, I'll tell you that. We didn't have the artistry of that. It was, but there were many late nights that I was at the Ghidra office doing the IBM Composer machine that, I don't know if any of you know what that is, but it's like a typewriter, but you have to type the line twice. And the first time it will do something to understand the justification of, of the margins, and then you type it the second time and it'll justify it. So that was the technology of the day, and we actually then, it typed on a piece of paper, and you had the piece of paper and you literally cut and paste onto your layout. And so Chinese Awareness tried to give Chinese news, Chinatown news, and ideas of what the community could be, and where there might, as we saw, were inequities. And part of going into the sewing factories, my Chinese is not good enough to have done that. I went with people who had the language facility, but is to talk about to people who were desperate to be able to make a living for their family, who felt lucky that they could work for almost nothing, and hours, and sacrifice so much for very little wage. They felt lucky to have that. To tell them this is not how you should be treated. This is not how other people are treated, and that you have a right to something better. Try to educate in that way. So we tried to put that into Chinese Awareness. There were people in our group who were fluent and could read and write Chinese. And so we had a Chinese version, part of it, and an English version. I, of course, could only work on the English version. And then we had some people who would take pictures, and we'd have photographs. And so that was the basic kind of format of what we did. And we put it out once a month, and we handed it out free to people. I cannot really remember how long it lasted. It seemed like it was a couple of years. And we would talk about these small things, like sometimes when you hand it out free, people don't value it, and they think, I don't want to take it. And then we thought, well, should we charge like 10 cents, or make it seem valuable to people if they had to pay for it, so they would read it. So we went through a number of those things, but we, eventually, because it was a college time and people were moving, we ran out of people, and ended up to be only 3 people, and then it was just too much to be done. But we were appreciative that Ghidra, saw that we were trying to do something, and allowed us to use the equipment, and gave us access to the office and so forth. We didn't have the means at all.
But I'm sure you gained a lot from that experience. What did you think you took away from that experience?
It's hard now to distinguish the retrospective and the actual learning. But I think as students, I think I saw that there were things that we could do. And it might not have been the actual things we did. But in organizing together, I think there were lessons about we can do more together, and that there are like-minded people. And when you think of who was there in those days, Judy Chu, Mike Ng, Stuart Kuo, May and Rocky, and they all, in a sense, we all went on to, incorporate those values in different ways, in how we chose to manifest those values, in elected office, in law, in nonprofits. But it was a place where we grew our moral values and our social justice values together.
Can you describe a little bit more about how would you articulate what those values were that kind of crystallized during that time?
It was I think there was a keener awareness of injustice that in some ways the immigrant generation says, okay, yes, we don't understand the culture well. Yes, we don't speak English well. So of course they're going to treat us differently. That's natural. They sort of accept that, and we came to understand that is not natural. That is not all right. People deserve the same as other people, even though they look different, they speak differently, they have different practices and traditions, and we have to fight for that. And fighting was not something my parents said, you go do that, But knowing that other people were also, that you speak up, you fight for what you believe is right, that people deserve equal treatment, that there is a promise in this country, and that it really is up to us to keep that promise. And where we keep that, where we ensure that is in the places we know best, which is the immigrant community. So we fight for that, we work for that. And along the way, when we see other injustices for other people, then we also have to stand up for that. So I think those were some of, when you look at Judy's work, or Mike's work in immigration law, and then as an elected, Stuart's work in advancing justice, they reflect those values. And it came at an important time.
Thank you. Just one more question about UCLA. You mentioned you were involved in Oriental Concern.
Mm-hmm.
Did that have any relationship to Chinese awareness, or was that kind of separate? And what can you remember about Oriental Concern?
Oriental Concern was, as I remember, it was more around UCLA students. Chinese awareness, drew from the region. There were people who came from Cal State and as well, and even some from USC and so forth. Different people came together at Chinatown. In fact, we welcomed people who came, and there was one young man, young now because I'm quite old, but he was our peer, and he came and he helped out, and later we found out he was a police informant, checking us out. So so it was very open. But Oriental Concern, as I remember, was mostly UCLA, and it was a lot of Japanese Americans. And I think as a Chinese American at that time at UCLA, it felt to me, maybe it's not technically accurate, but it felt to me as though the Asian American movement was dominated by Japanese. And they were the larger population. Chinese had not had the huge immigration yet. And I didn't meet my first Korean until I was 19, and I never had Japanese food until I was 20. So, so I wasn't quite multicultural yet. It was very limited diversity in terms of Asian Americans. I knew of maybe one Filipino, But when I felt when people were talking about the Asian American movement here in Los Angeles, they were really talking about Japanese, and they didn't really see the Chinese. And so I think in part that drew me back to Chinatown. So there was some dominant groups, that also then dominated some of the narrative for Asian American movement, at least here. And I'm sure in San Francisco it was more of a Chinese narrative, but in LA it was more, in my view, of a Japanese narrative.
What about, you said the women's liberation movement also was an influence on you? And, was that, how did you, what was it that was attractive to you about the women's liberation movement?
Let me count the ways. Again, my background is an immigrant, raised in a fairly traditional household with 3 daughters. And my mother was a homemaker. She did not work outside the home. And she had some very traditional values for girls. We were all expected to go to college, but it felt as though it was more to find better husbands than to have a career. And it was always important for my mother, who was, I'll say was quite a beauty, for girls to look pretty. And I think that's how she felt she was able to succeed in the world, move forward in the world. And so she wanted us to be, to have that image, that traditional, excuse me, women's role, women's image. And I did not, I didn't feel comfortable with it, but I didn't know what the alternative was. And the women's movement helped to describe the alternative, that you could actually be a full person, and you didn't have to be pretty and proper all the time. And so it was really liberating for me to think that could be true, and I wanted that. And so, and I found other women, and Asian American women, who also wanted that, who wanted to at least explore that, to have the option to explore. And so in groups, we would talk about those things, and about, I remember one woman my age at the time, in her 20s, talked about wearing makeup, and that she looked very different when she wore makeup. And people liked how she looked wearing makeup. And so when she didn't wear makeup, she was criticized. Why don't you put something, why don't you look better? Is really the essence of that. And to have a group to be able to say that, that here are the norms and here's how it hurts me, was very powerful, and was, in a way, healing the old demands, that you could release those and be more free to be whoever you were.
Did you take May Chen's, one of the, I think she taught, right, you ever taught one of the first Asian American women's classes?
I did not. I did not take her class. And I guess it's too late now. Many regrets that I have, but no, I did not. So I left UCLA with a bachelor's in psychology. Not a lot you can do with that, in terms of immediate job. Although I never regretted the psychology degree. It served me well over many years dealing with people. But I went back to Chinatown. I wanted, at the time, I wanted to just help people. And I worked, I was able to get a job in Chinatown at the psychiatric hospital there at the time. There is no psychiatric hospital now there. but I worked as a social worker case aide, very entry level, but I got to see not only Chinese but others who came, and I realized a few things. One is that I didn't have enough language capacity to really work with the population I had in mind. And two is I didn't have enough training. I actually burned out after 2 years in that job because I didn't know how to set boundaries. So then my solution for burnout after 2 years as a social work case aide was to leave the country. And I bought a one-way ticket to Hong Kong and spent about a year living in Hong Kong. And that was eye-opening too. It's the trying to belong somewhere else and realizing that I did not, and then the experience and help put better definition for who I was and who I am. And so coming back, I started to work in other nonprofits. At the time, the name, Oriental was very popular even in our communities, and so Oriental Service Center, did casework there. I remember my salary was $500 a month, and I was able to live on my own apartment. It was, quite the day. So, and I thought I wanted to be a social worker, that I would have to go back to school and be a social worker. So I did apply for MSW programs, and I applied for the Master's in Public Administration program at USC as well. And I applied to, I think, a school in Denver, and I was accepted. And I decided, because I got the full scholarship at USC, that I would go for the MPA. And I was also beginning to realize that I wasn't actually that good at social work. I didn't have quite the patience for individual work. So, so more macro work seemed appropriate for me, and so I went to get the master's, and after that continued to work in nonprofits where, not always in the Asian American community, but organizations that served those who were treated less than and who were vulnerable. So I went to work after my master's for a youth program, and then for the International Institute. And then from there, I was recruited to go to Chinatown Service Center, really in what was a operations, a COO type of position. It was called the deputy director. And I liked operations because it kept me in the background, and I could organize things, and it was I think a good match for my skill set. And I was there for 7 years in that role. And then the executive director, Irene Chu, we worked very well together. And she was younger than I am, but she decided she was going to leave and retire and, take care of her children. So, so I had to make a choice. And so I was rather a reluctant executive director, but I did become the executive director. And I started January 2nd of 1989. And then continued. I think I'm probably still the longest serving executive of Chinatown Service Center. in their history. But I
How many years did you serve?
I served 12 years as executive director. And then in 2000 I left. Also burned out. I think that during those years I was quite active in APCON and was the APCON president during. I was elected in early April of 1992, and in late April of 1992 were the LA riots. And so it thrust me into more media exposure and more, cross-community collaborations than I had ever done over those 2 years. And it really felt like sort of a trial by fire, and yet I am grateful to have been in a place where I could contribute, and and from there, in the course of my career, served on many boards. At that particular time, there was an organization that was formed called the Multicultural Collaborative. Stuart Cole was there, Arturo Vargas, who was with Naleo, not at that time, but was there. And so a number of us came together and tried to do something that was meaningful across communities around social justice. And so, a number of boards from there. But eventually in 2000, at the end of 2000, I left Chinatown Service Center. And it was hard to leave. It was, but I was quite burned out because I was working in a community that was, even though I never lived in Chinatown, it was still my neighborhood. It was still my community. And my father worked across the street. And, in the early years, I would just, my American self would cringe when people said, "Oh, I know your dad." And I was like, oh, But over time, I accepted it. And over time, people would say, "Oh, she's your daughter." So I made my own reputation that my father, I think, was proud of. And so it was hard to leave, but I was quite burned out because I always felt failure was never an option. The stakes were always very high, and my back was always against the wall, and I always had to figure it out. And so over years, it took a toll, and it took a toll on my family, and so I decided I would leave. And I didn't feel that I could leave. I could just say, I'm tired, I'm burned out. It just didn't seem a good enough reason. So I felt I had to get another job that appeared as though it were a step up. So I became president of the LA Women's Foundation. And while the title, gave me enough cover to leave Chinatown, the foundation was much smaller. And it was, a hard fundraising type of job. And so I really didn't stay very long. I didn't want to be an executive anymore. I just didn't realize it. So I left after a year. I spent time on the board, and then Chinatown Service Center asked me to serve on their board, and so I went on that board. But I stopped long-term organization work. I became a consultant, became a teacher at Northridge in nonprofit management, and but in the course of that, I was interim executive for many organizations for periods between 6 months and as long as 18 months sometimes. So Liberty Hill Foundation, JACCC, Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, so many different issues. The consulting format allowed me to go into many organizations and usually in a time of crisis and try to help organizations. You know, I didn't have the patience to casework individuals, but you know, caseworking organizations was a little bit more suitable. So I had many interim executive assignments in the course of things, and I'm grateful that people asked me to do it. So felt that I could help them.
Well, so that was from 2001 when you left the Women's Foundation.
Yes.
And then to now, so that's about 18 years of consulting with different organizations.
I retired about 3 years ago, so it was about 16 years of consulting, and at the same time I started at Northridge, so 16 years at Northridge and consulting, you know, as you know, adjunct. So I helped them structure their nonprofit management focus in the MPA program. So, but they've changed a lot. It's a moving target. So, but I'm no longer affiliated. I'm just full-time grandma now. So,
well deserved.
yeah. Well, you know, I'm very grateful for the opportunity that Chinatown Service Center gave me. Really, I was 30 years old when I started there, and when I left, I was 50. So, you know, I grew up there, and when you're growing up professionally and personally, you make a lot of mistakes, and so I appreciate that they tolerated all the mistakes that I made. I think that some of the things that I did is just put some organizational structure. I mean, that is something that that comes fairly naturally to me, to build and organize infrastructure. And I realize, and that's why I was so comfortable in that background, is if you do it well, you become invisible. Everything just runs smoothly and nobody notices. And that was a very comfortable thing to be. Executives, you have to be out there in the world and doing other things. So I think at least I did that invisible thing at Chinatown Service Center. But I think in terms of community, well, let me back up a little bit to say, having done that, you know, I also recognize, having invested my entire career in nonprofits, is that nonprofit organizations often don't see the value of that. They see the value of a mission and a program and touching lives. But to support that, you have to have a strong infrastructure. Otherwise, organizations fall apart. You know, grants don't get fulfilled. You know, all those kind of operational details are lacking. And many people, including myself, we go into nonprofits because we believe in the mission. We're mission-driven people. But not often are there, you know, kind of structural, administrative type people who come with those skills, you know, and want to do mission-driven work. It's like it's hard to find accountants who will work at nonprofits because they can market anywhere, and unless they're mission-driven. So I think it's an area that needs more development in nonprofits always. So at any rate, I was able to contribute that, but I think programmatically, one of the things that happened during my time at the Service Center, we had many programs, you know, a very large employment program, we had a youth program, we had casework, we had mental health, we had a health clinic. But when we did the demographics of our community, we could see that affordable housing was really needed. and it would continue to be a high need. And so one of the things that I was able to do was to work with the board to get comfortable to take on this huge area of service for the community, and eventually able to build 2 affordable housing complexes in Chinatown. The second I did not see to completion because I left, but it did complete with a child development facility and so forth. And I think that was an important expansion of the service center's offerings for the community. So I think that was probably the largest piece of it. And we were able to purchase a permanent location. So we had a home. During my earlier years as a service center, we had to move several times, and often without much notice. And we would end up, we spent many years, because of very short notice, we had to vacate. We spent many years in a condemned juvenile courthouse in Chinatown, waiting for them to demolish it, but we would use the courtrooms for our offices and so forth, and then in former factories and things like that. And so I was able to close the purchase of an office condominium, where the service center still has offices.
Those are huge accomplishments.
well, they seemed daunting and necessary at the time. So I'm just like, phew, I got through it. So I was lucky.
Like, what do you learn from those experiences where you really can't see the end of the tunnel when you start, and you're not sure? I mean, you've never done this before, so you're not exactly sure what's going to happen, but you go for it anyway. I mean, when you look back at it, it's pretty remarkable.
Yes, you just. I think there's a short and a long view that you have to hold simultaneously. And the short view is you have to look down at your feet and put one foot in front of the other and keep going. And the long view is to see the vision that you're going for, and hope for the best. And that's why even for young professionals who maybe want to be executive directors, I will say you have to love the work, because if you don't love it, it will be terrible, because you have to keep fighting, forward. And it helps if you love it, then you're motivated to keep doing it, to keep, hacking the machete through the jungle and get to where you need to go.
That's a really good metaphor. And then there's things, unknowns that come jumping out at you.
That's right.
All the while, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, what would you say were some of the most challenging times doing that work of, it's really community building, literally and figuratively, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the most challenging times, and what insights might you have that you'd like to share? Because other people are
goodness. And
following your path.
I think I would say everyone walks a different path and in a different time. So the time that I went through being executive director, a long-term executive director, and building an organization, that time is gone, and there'll be new challenges for the current times. The political challenges are very different. The philanthropic challenges of how you court money, and how you navigate policies, in the city, at the state level. So it will always be different. And I can only say, believe in what you're doing and have allies. None of us do it alone. As much as we might be credited, none of us do it alone. I was lucky to have a good management team, and although the management team changed, those were stressful times when you have to replace people and, you know, build a new team, because the team is very important. You have to have the team with you. That none of us do it alone. There are no self-made people, regardless of the myth.
Who are the key allyships, and how were you able to build and sustain them?
There are internal teams, you know, our senior management team. There always is a senior management team that you can build. I know my style may be a little bit straightforward and cut and dry sometimes, but if somebody isn't working in the team, I transition those people and, you know, continue to build the team. I know other people have different approaches to building teams, but the external team, you know, that was really AppCon. AppCon was it was a lot of fun for me because nobody was anybody's boss. You were all peers, and you recognized people's talents, and you asked them to help you when you needed those talents, and there was a lot of trust. So trust and long-term allies are really important, and those friendships have endured to this day, post-retirement, and they are lifelong friendships and trustful relationships.
For those who don't know what AppCon is, can you say like what it stands for and what it was?
AppCon is the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, a coalition of Asian American nonprofits, or nonprofits that work in Asian American communities or with Asian American populations. And it is the leadership of those organizations that come together and coordinate services, advocacy, various things. We have gone to the state capitol together. We have gone to City Hall together. We have advocated the Board of Supervisors together, and in matters that affect all our communities. And it is an example that we do need, you know, allies, and we do need partnerships, that we don't do it alone.
Can we pause and say?
Can you identify particular people, issues, events, or aha moments that have made you who you are today?
I find that question difficult. At 70, it seems like a lot of years to try to think back on. On the personal side, I would say the incident in the coffee house in Central California was my family, in which they were clearly acting in a prejudicial way to my family because we were Chinese, people of color, different. That left me with a huge impression. I didn't understand it at the time, but I remembered it, and in retrospect see it as a moment of injustice that probably moved me to want to write for young children, for proud fathers, you know, for anyone who innocently is made to feel less. So I think that is a moment. And then, while no one particular incident, I think the women's study groups were important. You know, to hear other women like me, you know, enough like me, speaking frankly and painfully sometimes. And while I grew up with sisters, we didn't talk that way. You know, we towed the line and of the family, and so so that was a breakthrough to see. And I think it's all of those personal moments. I, like many other people, remember when I heard about the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and how it changed what I thought was a civilized country in my mind. And to realize then that my role in that country had to change. So I think those would stick out in my mind in particular. Although if you gave me another hour, I probably could come up with a few more. But that perhaps that will suffice. I think I've been very lucky. You know, I'm very grateful for the life I was able to live, and contributions that I was at least allowed to attempt. And so I hope for other people that they get a chance, you know, to every day do something for their values. And I know not everyone gets that chance. So that is why I feel particularly grateful for the life that I've had.